So maybe since we only have an hour, let's just briefly go around and introduce ourselves and our pronouns. So I'll start. My name's Angie. I'm the author of the exhibit, and it's she, her, hers.
I'm Gabe, he or she, him, and art historian. I teach at Regis University.
Everyone, I'm Kate Nicholson, she, her, hers. My name is Horace Attorney, and I'm on the board of an arts organization called Tilt West that has roundtable conversations just like this.
Hi, I'm Keely Boyd. I'm a writer, she, her.
I'm Jane Burke. I'm a first-year fellow at Denver Art Museum, and she, her.
I'm Stephen Frost. I'm an instructor at the University of Colorado Boulder. What is the name of that place? And also the director of the BC Center for Media Arts and Performance. I use they, them pronouns. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Daria Medic, an artist and educator at the same learning institution. And I'm a sheeper.
Hi everyone, I'm Luisa Turbo. I'm a filmmaker. I'm also teaching at the same institution with these guys in critical media practices department. And yeah, I use she, her, her.
I'm the director of the Iconoclash Studio of Arts teaching, and I do tech art, she, hers.
Eric Dalmore, founder of the Scene Gallery, now designing and doing more
Eric DeMarche. I'm the president of Denver chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America. I'm a international archaeology consultant specializing in pre-COVID, I was actually in Afghanistan. So I've seen the negative side of cultural heritage disruption firsthand. And I continue to work with things like the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab, which monitors cultural destruction in war zones. Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab is a program affiliated with Smithsonian. So that's what I'm doing now. Right now I'm in Istanbul, trying to help friends and colleagues in Afghanistan as well, cultural preservation efforts with the recent Taliban surge.
Great, thanks, Eric. So it's a little bit structured like Tilt, where there's no moderator. But I am going to start with the introduction, and I've written this out. So it's basically what I'm going to say, but that sort of keeps us on track since we only have an hour. People are welcome to stay and ask more questions and continue the dialogue if they'd like. Okay. So there were 3 prompts that I sent to everybody, and we'll see how it goes in terms of how much we want to talk about each prompt. Okay? So in Bruno Latour's essay for the 2002 art exhibit at ZKM, What is Iconoclash? Latour coins the term iconoclash to describe the uncertainty in the gesture of image destruction. He demonstrates how it can be interpreted as destructive or constructed by either the iconoclast and or the audience. He categorizes 5 types of iconoclast to analyze how image destruction is ambiguous. So briefly, I'm just going to list those 5 classifications. The first one is the classical iconoclasts who want to do away with all image mediation. An example, the Byzantine iconoclasts. The type B are anti-freeze frame iconoclasts who like images but not permanent or static ones. They want to update and upgrade images as quickly as possible, requiring the destruction of former images. An example, remixers, appropriation artists who draw from older images and renew them. Type C, provocateurs, are against images only of their opponents. They attack the object deemed to represent their opponent. The opponents may not have cherished the image before, but because they are a target of attack, they begin to attach more importance to the image. Flag burning is an example, or the destruction of Robert E. Lee statues is an example of the BLM iconoclasts who attack it for its reading as a symbol for white supremacy groups. Type D, innocent vandals don't hate images, but destroy them out of ignorance, greed, or blind passion. Examples are urban planners, architects, fusion cuisine, restoration. And type E are the agnostic blasphemers who just love to destroy, and they are asserting their right not including many images. An example is like shock art. So iconoclash in art, Latour points to remix or appropriation art forms that rely on intertextuality or preceding narratives and the forms of self-reflexivity and the necessity to destroy former images or narratives. So the first prompt, in a global world with a rapidly dynamic renovation of mediated images, how will a constant change in representations affect our memories, archiving, and or the manifestations of our heroes or unifying narratives? So I'll leave it to the group to start the discussion.
I think we're in the midst of that already with Instagram and internet, and every image is disposable. Everything rises for a moment and then is gone and is replaced with something else. And I think that there are very few heroes left. I think that almost everything has 15 minutes or 15 seconds of fame and then is gone. I think we're already in the midst of that, and I think that all heroes die.
I think all heroes die eventually, but there are certain voices who rise up. I mean, in that context, we had Donald Trump, who was in the media constantly and on Twitter constantly and on, so it's just a different, even though we're rapidly sort of replacing images, we still have some, it seems to me, that become more fixed as well. Usually doesn't power.
I think it's like the rapidness. It's interesting. I was talking to Aaron and Nord about this when I first saw your show, and there's a man named Terrence McKenna who did a lot of mushrooms, but he basically decoded the I Ching and talked about how like there's a timeline continuum, and about how now sort of our whole civilization is flatlining, and essentially saying, like Rome is falling 9 times a day now. Like we can't, because I think the whole idea of all of these sort of icons, and yeah, they're sort of longevity, and now it's really this connection between the way that art is made of these public images and how they're preserved. You look at Mao Zedong, now he's a pop culture reference, so I think Donald Trump is already on his way to do that too.
We started by talking about the digital image. I mean, there are a lot of images that we can talk about. And in that realm, computers have 2 types of memories. They have a short-term memory and a long-term memory. So yes, the rapidness of Instagram, and I think you mentioned, is very fast and short-term. However, they're stored forever. So that's another aspect. They're archived. We cannot get rid of them. Actually, the drawback of that is that if you've done something stupid in the past, it's always going to be back and it's stored online. So I think that's interesting how we have 2 different time frames we're working in terms of refreshing constantly the now heroes, but at the same time having a way to track back all the way to, childhood and memories that maybe we want them deleted, or images that we want them deleted about heroes.
Yeah, I think smashing statues is nothing new, right? Like, religious texts are full of this conversation, whether it's Moses and the golden calf, or it's Muhammad idol toppling, or ISIS reducing Persian idols. Like, it's all about, I think it's a signal of a decision for a call to new leadership and wanting to make people pick sides, what's good and what's bad. And even to go back to the person you've been pointing us to, Latour, a lot, he's written a lot in specifically like the 80s, that, we don't just distrust facts based on their veracity, we distrust the institutions that present those facts. And so I think it's just like one signal of a much bigger problem than the access, easy access to information, that's who's presenting that information, who researched that information from the start, who did you interview in that information. I think there's just a huge distrust that is from science institutions to media to government that creates this kind of a cesspool of how to like really pin down any one thing to be fixed, and that monuments are just one kind of flag.
There's, it's kind of a time-honored notion that part of significance is longevity. People fall back on that in a lot of ways. And I wonder if even in changing the things, that notion has begun to lose some of its importance or some of its significance. And it's kind of pulling in something from another field that a teacher of mine once said to me. They were talking about something, and it seemed very profound to me. I asked them, it was an informal moment. I said, should I be taking notes? And what he said to me was, it's important that you pay attention, not that you remember. And that kind of blew my mind, because I always sort of thought remembering was a real big part of, if something important, you need to remember this. And the notion of what I was saying before about was longevity now being questioned. Because what I got from what he said to me was that being present to something and absorbing something all the ways that you possibly do, remembering it for a pop quiz is perhaps not as significant as you think.
I think that's really interesting. It makes me think of like back in the 60s or 70s, Ram Dass, be here now, for those that are familiar with it. Just be in the moment, exist in the moment. And yet I think we still need to have some guideposts along the way. I think without guideposts, we don't learn. Guideposts are what we make decisions by, whether they're artistic ones or personal experiences in life. And I think there has to be a balance between living in the moment, but still having some solidity, some foundations that we can rely upon.
I kind of wonder where they come from, though. And I don't disagree, by the way, with what you're saying. I just kind of question where those guideposts come from and where they perhaps steer us consciously or unconsciously.
Memory itself is mutable. I mean, we tend to think of it as this fixed thing, but that's not how our brain works, right? It's constantly remixing for new experiences. It's a reflection in a sense of our neurology as well.
Yeah. There's a photographer, probably some of you are familiar with Iconophrenzy, and she, in her memoir, there's this line where she said, there are people I have photographed so many times that I no longer have any memories of them.
Yeah. It's about repetition too. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Who was that?
Sorry.
What's that?
It's interesting you brought up memory, because since your exhibition's being talked about this exhibition over a year ago, there's always this, for me, the big thing that I keep coming back to. I keep trying to go off into other areas, but I keep coming back to the central theme of like our brains. We almost have to sort of like comparing memory to the world culture. We have to. It's almost like if we start with just, let's call it like Middle Eastern, European, South, like if we just broke it down by large culture groups, right? And all we did was stuck with, if my civilization would continue forever in this perfect vertical column, so had Russian or Eastern European, or however you want to look at it. If we never make room for new things to happen, just like our brain, right? You have to kind of wash out some old stuff so you can make some new stuff happen. So I keep going back to this thought. It's a little bit off topic from where you two started, but like what? We never should lose the histories, but it's almost like we should keep these histories of these icons, and then sometimes like it might be okay to sort of take them off their plinth, literally, and move them over here. I'm not saying destroy them necessarily, because then we have to really dive into the reasons why, right? But maybe they should be put over here, some new ideas, because civilization is changing. We're changing rapidly, like you said, with social media even, that's changing everything for a lot of people, and this idea of time and remembrance and where does it stand? So I keep going back to that, like, as a group, I guess the question would sort of be like, do you find it problematic that, or is it part of the natural cycle that we have to sort of remove some of the bigger, the suns that are standing there, shining light on everything. You get to sort of move the sun every now and again to have room for what's beyond the sun. The fact that we're part of a larger and more complex set of ideas, beliefs, values that are constantly changing now.
I think an interesting thing is going back to what an icon is, or when does something become an icon? And it is when it reaches a certain amount of people. And that took a very long time beforehand versus now when it can reach considerably more people. I don't want to give numbers because I don't have them, but folds of X folds times of people in way less actual time. So that means that things can become iconic very fast. And then the second part of it is exactly what was mentioned. Beforehand, once something became iconic, it would take form of a sculpture, a statue, a writing, an image of a church. That's where icon comes from, right? Icons. And then it will stay there for even longer, the longevity part here, to be a reference system for people to go back to. So I'm just wrapping up your thoughts. I'm not dedicated it tonight, but I'm wrapping up some of the thoughts that you said here. So I found it interesting that the differentiation between the types of people, and usually we don't want to say that we're one of those, but I would like you to think for 30 seconds which type of you are. You don't have to share, but just be honest with yourself, because I know which type I am, and I find it very interesting the way it was described. Anyway, just better thoughts.
And Latour does point out too that A's could be B's and B's could be C's, or even D. There's a confusion of your own role and also how people read it. We also don't want to associate ourselves with that, but we do have some behaviors like that in parts of buildings. Yeah.
And I think these are very fluid, and I think A, B, D, and E all could fall into C very easily. All of them could revert to saying, I'm right, everybody else is wrong, no matter where you start. Once you get established as being creating your own authority, or
the community you're in.
Yes,
how
exactly.
The group think around you.
So you might start out as A, B, D, or E, but I think a lot of people, especially as they age, kind of regress and fall into that C category.
Yeah. I was thinking how Clint Smith has this book out where he went to all these different plantations and how they're historic landmarks, and went to see what they were doing and how they were dealing with the complicated history. Were they a wedding site, or are they did they put up signage? And something that was really, I thought, especially that came out of his writing was that when he encounters people who are celebrating a great-great-grandfather who was a Confederate soldier, and they get together and celebrate it, he said the reason it's hard to reach those people to see a complicated view on their ancestor is because those stories of their father or grandfather were passed down from people they trust, right? It's people who raised them. This is this amazing thing that your grandfather did. And so they see history different because of memory. And how are you gonna fix that? You're gonna tell them, that person who taught you that grandma, she was wrong. You should not trust her account. Or what are you asking them to give up when you're asking them to give up this thing that is attached to their family, or see it from a point of view where maybe great-grandpa was a bad guy, and so memory can be really complicated and attached to a site and history and a monument because you're taking something from a person, something handed to them through a system of trust through family, and then asking them to be maybe problematize it. And it's possible, but it's why these things are really challenging. Memory makes it actually harder. The experience makes it harder.
I think also when you talk about some of that especially to get into issues involving war.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who, served in wars that were socially, politically very unpopular.
Mm-hmm.
And that when those people were attacked for their participation in those wars,
mm-hmm.
what they have as a frame of reference are these very personal, cathartic moments beyond anything most of us have ever experienced.
Mm-hmm.
That they're relating to it on that level. Politics are not present, and the ideas and the beliefs And all that history and stuff isn't really a part of that story. And that's where, like, a lot of, or some amount of PTSD comes from people who have experienced that stuff at a level that once they're taken out of it, they're dropped into an environment that has no real concept of what was going on and are being bombarded with, well, don't you know that this idea or that belief or this economy or these concepts that don't really relate, they don't really relate to the moment of being present here.
That's why, even though reenactments are very strange to me, I prefer them to monuments because they at least show all the rewards where you're like, wow, that fight was 10 minutes.
Have you ever seen?
You know, like
Have you? I've never seen a reenactment. Have you seen?
Yeah, they're really weird. They're really awkward. Because then we have this thing where we give legitimacy depending on who reenacts it. Like, especially out here in the West.
Are they scripted?
Huh?
Are they scripted?
Yeah, usually there's some kind of, group of community people who get together. Maybe as a hobby, they restore wagons and they bring it out and all these, there's a lot of passion and interest behind it. But you're always like, well, you hear people be like, well, that custard glass stand's better because they're real Native Americans in it, and you're just like, but none of these people it's not like we've transported them through time, these are just people. But they're very odd, and so I feel like they're better because they're in that space between where no one gets to own how the story is told.
I love that phrase. I like reenactments better than statues.
And they're really weird, but I think it's important to sit in the discomfort, and monuments don't always let you sit in that,
What is a reenactment?
But I think the mythology, that's what it's perpetuating, right? Like it's any kind of storytelling. Because even when we got reenactment, it made me think about,
What are you reenacting?
the East Coast of Plymouth Rock, something that's very, and then on the other hand, a myth that I think is perpetuated still is like Hawaii. Like you have a lot of people going to hula. I think there's always these ideas of there's some mind control, right? So like perpetuating this mythology. So again, when I look at I just keep looking at these names, and I think to me now, I feel like there are these versions of cults, right? Like there's this cultish worship, right? Of even Buddha, right? There's a million different sects of Buddhism that all can be kind of reduced to a cult-like behavior where you have these specific icons of what you're talking about, kind of like, it's fascinating the way it permeates political and the religion, right? Like they're accepting always to make this iconography always relevant because it's typically people beefing and being like, well, my Buddhism is better than your Buddhism, and I think it's really fascinating in this way. It's not like what Kaylee was saying, like it's been, I think, all through human civilization, and now we're just confronting it in a way of like, what is the archive? What is the kind of remnant of it? And I think working in a museum, I always feel conflicted, right? We have all these icons and sometimes they are contextualized, so you don't know their meaning. You just kind of blindly are like fetishizing these things at the same time, right? So I think that's an interesting part about the lifespan of the actual physical object too.
I'm fascinated by the fetishizing aspect together with the reenactment because it shows the embodiment of the icons as simplistic as it can be for a Halloween party where everybody expects the iconic costume to be recognized. I'm thinking culture shock last year on that. So I think the experience that is not only visual, but is also even if it's following a script, and there's like a little bit of conversation here, is like exactly are they reenactment, that to what extent are they doing it, and who writes the script and what's the vision behind that, to even fetishizing to an extent that maybe being beyond comfortable. I think those are very important aspects because it shows a mixture together. It's a little bit on the third prompt, like what does it mean to bring something in the context, talking about being in the present, right? So you don't necessarily forget, but you also bring it in the present for your own body. It is more than what you see by watching a sculpture or being a sculptor in the museum or outside.
the sculpture would just be like marble or rock that's carved, right? But the difference between the reenactment is somebody else who is in a position of power is giving his narrative and interpretation of history and memory. And that's a really big difference, because if we just look at a statue, it's just rock with marks like chipped away. Mm-hmm. And then we put the narrative onto it.
Is the sculpture commissioned?
I was gonna say power structures usually are the ones who decide who gets to make the sculpture though too, so I would say that that's scripted as well.
Yes.
I'm not sure, it may be less apparent, it's less immediately apparent that there's a script, but it's very much there, and in some ways more enduring and powerful than a reenactment, which is at least temporary.
It's temporary, right?
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, now we have so many, I think, points of power, centrals of power. In the past, I think it used to be the church and the government.
Right.
And then in recent decades, corporations have arisen.
Yeah.
And now with the internet and social media, I think we have so many points of power that are competing with each other.
Absolutely.
And, we have to determine which ones we've got to trust, which institutions can be trustworthy. And do they have any responsibility that we can hold them accountable for or not?
And how they, because you were talking sort of about pop iconography, you mentioned at the beginning, right? So it's not necessarily a power structure, like usually the people who rise are, there's a power structure a step away, whether they're a pop musician or something, but there is a little bit of a democratization theoretically in this sort of pop icon. It certainly didn't exist when the church was deciding, what was.
And what becomes the kind of definitions of power, because there's people on the internet with a zillion followers, and that can be defined as a kind of power. They can't pay their rent or whatever. They haven't always been able to translate it into this system powerfully. And so, it's kind of like, and like somebody was saying before that, a band blows up and they're iconic after 2 days or 3 days.
Right.
Down the line, how do we really look at those things in the moment of what means something? It's like, it does seem in some ways many things have been trivialized, where they seem important for a moment, but when you want to talk about something that's epic or of lasting power, does that require, what is the definition of that? You have to make it for 10 years at the top of the pile and then you're something. And, if you only make it 9.5 years out, or how do you define these things? Are you epic and powerful within this little niche of people? And how does that relate to the greater society at large? It's hard to know these things, I think, or what really does something mean anymore? How do you get to that?
It is like the repetition of the visibility, right? Because that's what they were using in Rome, or wherever. They were constantly having the same iconography to kind of perpetuate that, right? So like somebody's destroying it, but and able to kind of replace that, right? And they have the power. And now I think, going back to what I was saying before, now I think it's just happening so fast. There's no real mythology. A lot of us are not following a church or a religion or a politician. I think that's what's so interesting, is now there's nothing to hold on to. It's all kind of like novelty, right? Because it's just, the cycle is going too fast. But to me, I feel like, we don't necessarily have the same reference points anymore even, right? But before, it was all kind of, even in the South, I'm from here, I don't know this all that well, but it's fascinating, to see what that means to people when they walk by these slave owners, these lauding, that real psychological thing that's happening, and I guess the way that people, like you're saying, with this personal, you have to kind of make a personal attachment, right, to something that now, it's fascinating that you could say Britney Spears is an icon. The way that there's she's a form of worship, worshiping a person. It's fascinating.
Maybe that's a perfect segue to the other prompt, right? On the empty plinths. Prompt 2. Yeah. How could remix be an effective or ineffective artistic political strategy when addressing the empty plinths left behind after the destruction and a removal of political figures of the past?
Isn't that kind of short-lived in the sense that I think if you pull a statue down and you put there, we at this time would look at that and feel and have a feeling about the absence of what was. Our kids, let's say, who never saw it there, now just see this empty space and they've heard stories and this and that. But I would say that the visceral significance and experience going forward in time, I don't know how it would stand up, frankly. I don't know.
Yeah, so I had some of the people here read an article, Ode to the Empty Plinth, that talks about a situation international and looking at it almost like a reenactment, or if it's a performance, a longevity performance of 40 years, looking at how different groups react to an empty plinth. And if we see it as a performance as opposed to a point in time, I see your point, like, yeah, 20 years, a person's not even gonna have a memory of the empty plinth. It's just an empty pedestal, they don't know what it was there before. Looking in the present, Keely had asked me, what do you think of the empty plinth? And it was a really great question. And I was thinking, that would be a great art project. As an artist, like, oh, I could see augmented reality. I could see like giving, like that is the moment of, as an educator as well, for all the people who passed by didn't notice what statue actually was there or weren't keeping up with local politics. That is like a moment for conversation. So for me, I always see like when things are destroyed, that just opens up a conversation that is possible.
What do you think the importance of context for it is? Because I think that would really swing things around depending on context around that empty space, that blank canvas, that empty plinth, that whatever. Just left on its own, like, I don't know. I mean, you walk out in the desert and, there were these weird, like, kind of 2001 things being dropped in the middle of
Utah, I think it's
Utah, and there were a few of them. And I thought that was kind of interesting because of the lack of context around it in terms of state. The context kind of became, this is crazy that this is here. But you know what I'm saying? Going back to the empty plinth, the blank, what is there a significance in your thinking to a context, or is it just anything goes?
I think it touches a lot on the attachment and how the attachment feels. Like you mentioned that because you've seen it for decades, people, like the ones that have seen it for decades, they get more attached to it versus the kids that may not have the same attachment, maybe some mental attachment to the stories from their parents. And then made me think of this, there's this short paragraph in Latour's book about science and images in science and symbolism in science. And we use a lot of symbolism in science, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting how we formulated those images of that symbolism so that we can easily detach from it because we are servants of the truth. So everything through a new instrument, through a new formula, through a new observation can be collapsed in a second. A scientific ground can be completely shaken to its core, and we accept that and move forward because we learned to use weird Greek characters and things that we cannot relate to. Like you really need to get into a different mind frame when you analyze a scientific formula, a scientific image, a scientific experiment that you don't really relate to. You can't embody it too much, and trying to do that through bioart, it's hard to embody all the scientific knowledge that I got through. So it's kind of, we formulated symbols and icons and images in a language that promotes detachment so we can be constantly servants of the truth. And it's kind of interesting that we don't do that. It's very different than the regular icons, but I was just mentioning because there's this paragraph that one Angie Eng for reading in the book, where there's a comparison between how artists look at icons versus how scientists look at symbols and images as part of their work. So it made me think of, why can I accept that my work is going to crash in a second? And I even demolish my own work. I say, the paper I published 3 years ago, how long have I read it? And I don't have any issues with that. And the reason is a certain form of detachment. So the question is, given that we don't have this memory of mythology and what it means, like what is the truth for us, how are we going to mend that with a need for attachment, a need for roots, a need for heritage, for who we are, and that was somehow represented through icons as well.
More images. That's what I propose. Because after I said, you're like, oh, the expense, what an opportunity. And then I went looking and I realized that of the 100 monuments that have been Confederate monuments that have been removed since 2015, since the Charleston Massacre, none of them have been destroyed. Some of them have been repaired, and many of them have just popped up in other places. Yeah. They're legally obligated to be put on display, so they're either in a graveyard or battlefield, or they've been privately acquired. And 18 states have put up legislation that says you can't take them down. So they're gonna stay. So and signage, we know, doesn't work. For the same reason that there is a limit to the possibilities of performance, because of confirmation bias. You're going to pick what you want to remember. You're going to digest and affirm your worldview. If you go to Monticello and you read a sign that Jefferson owned 600 slaves, you're like, that's not true, because it doesn't fit within your worldview. You went there so you can fit in and feel like you're an American. And so if signage, we know signage doesn't work, because you're going to, anything that refutes your worldview, you're going to say that's irrelevant. So I think either leave up defaced monuments, because at least it demonstrates to the viewer that there is dissent about what this person means, or that we put up a competing monument nearby, which is what some states are doing, is if there's some settler monument that was like, she was great against those Indians and fighting them, we put up something from like the local nation that competes with that, and it acknowledges their story as well.
Classic counter speech.
Yeah. Or I also think that instead of museums having to take care of a monument, that those funds go towards something like an experiential, emotional, like immersive experience where you're like, what is it like to encounter hate speech? I mean, we never have. Or what's it like, what's it like to walk a day in the shoes of a migrant crossing the border, which I know was like a film that came here recently. But like those things, because it goes the opposite of your science experiment, it taps into an emotional part that makes someone sit in discomfort, which they don't have to do when they look at a Christopher Columbus monument and they're Italian. Like they're just like, I don't have to sit in any kind of discomfort, I just can reaffirm what I already think. If I put someone in a situation where they have to sit in something that makes them really uncomfortable, maybe that opens a window, but I don't think the empty flints actually.
It could be like a revolving door, like they could have storage, and depending on what administration, you can just roll out the different monuments for the period of time that there is.
I think that already. It's interesting about like where do they go, right? Because I think that even the act of storing, you're putting money towards the storage of it, or like the fact that you can't re-erect them in many, like reading about the laws, that has to be a place of equal prominence. Like that to me is trippy. Like who's judging that? And like I think it's really interesting where you look at the British Museum, essentially these are these civilizations like icons. And then you decide, I think that there's a whole other conversation about ownership and how then I think my question is, when you replace them though, like how do you decide, who gets to decide what is being remade?
It's the perfect cliche though, that history is written by the victor. So whoever is in the winning position at that time gets to drag out their stuff that reflects what they want to believe and think. And then when they get displaced by the other side, they have to put them away and bring out the other. When do we really get past this, this struggle to have, people are always going to feel misrepresented by that or represented by this, and how it gets played out in public.
My idea is to found this plinth that every 3 months or so, we have a different local artist create something along the same theme from maybe a different underrepresented group that say, this 3 months this artist has chosen to create something for this plinth, and then 3 months later, another artist, local artist, has chosen to create something. So you have all these different ideas being presented, changing every 3 months.
I think it would be better than what it is. I see something about it kind of works, but it's in the fluidity of it, right?
Does it suggest there's a sort of failure to what we're talking about? Is there really creation and construction going on in any narrative, or are we just recycling the same things as this sort of recycle everything must go, sail the will come back again in another form, which Angie's commentary I think is quite good about the sort of nature of it, and the kitchenification of it is a whole other thing, which I think is interesting that you point out. So maybe we aren't actually creating new narratives and new possibilities. But there are also artists who are doing, sort of, when you talk about remix, some interesting things. Like I know this artist, Karen Olivier, took the empty plinth and put mirrors around it. So it was actually just a reflection of everyone walking by and what was actually happening in real time. And it also even reflected this idea that people like to look at themselves, or maybe the vanity of the icon society or whatever, but it seemed in some weird way kind of intriguing to me that might be just that. I guess that makes me a bee or in this moment.
But I do feel like icons, the way they survive is because they are concrete and like something abstract. Like I'm afraid if we would say like, let the local artist, if they're gonna put something weird, like a red triangle up and be like, oh, that's an abstract theory, I don't know what to do with it. And like it won't stick. Like, yeah.
Maybe it shouldn't, like what you were talking about, like you're not attached to your studies. At the moment you are, but then you know that you're gonna have to let go. So like as a bee, I know all the images that I make, they're gonna have to go and be remixed. And that's happened to me where I approach, somebody to collaborate with, and they say, no, I just want to use your images.
I don't want to work with you.
Okay, I have to accept that. Go ahead, use my image. Occupational. But then I think of, the idea of like what to do with these empty plinths, and if we are attached to the idea of the monument and the icon, what if we detach from it and have this discussion that we can, as a lot of us are activists, just act in the present, and that yes, if we accept that it will only stand for 2 months, 1 year, it stood for 2 months, 1 year. If you think about the Fourier sculpture that was removed by the Nazis, it was constantly changing, not very quickly, but it did change over 50 years until the state took over 50 years later and says, no, we're gonna put this apple. They get the jury together. And so then people had 2 generations to do something with that empty plinth. So I think that there are many possibilities with empty plinths, and then like the rearrangement and the remixing, and also leaving some vandalized, so that that's a present narrative that's happening right now. It's really important that we also notice that the governments are trying to erase as soon as they're vandalized, to erase that narrative. But in that way, I see it as a performance, like we can continue, as opposed to be attached to, no, we want to put our narrative and our identity of another icon, which somebody else will remove sooner or later.
Yeah, I definitely think we can question also the medium, right? The medium is the message, like what's the plinth, the idea of putting something bigger up there and kind of looking up to something. I don't know, we can like criticize that and say maybe we don't need any plinths, maybe we don't need any statues, monuments, or icons, or like, same with social media. There's not one or the other who is like famous. It's the whole medium that has the power, right? That changes things, right?
We've become, though, as a people in so many endless ways, dependent on and bred to feel and think the opposite of what you're pointing at.
Yeah.
Because there is lots of psychologicals about any externalized blah, blah, blah has its issues and problems, that you're not doing a kind of inner work that would make all of that stuff less needy, all the way down to fortune cookie, if you meet the Buddha, kill him, kind of ways of thinking.
Yeah.
But that is not who we are as a people. We are our Instagram feeds and everything we've been trained to be.
We
And
can hope to become something else.
I think we could. I think we have to be in recognition, a really broad recognition of what is the issue. What do you tear that down because it represents bad things that those people did and blah, 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 or do you tear it down
It's
because?
also important to keep things. I'm not saying like destroy everything. I'm pro keeping those statues somewhere in a museum, recontextualized. Like, we need to teach the history as it was. Like, if we forget it, we repeat it, right? So those things need to be there, but maybe, questioning those positions of power that are in the cities. And
Yeah, they don't have to keep all 4,000 Lenin statues, maybe just one in the museum, right?
I think that's true because I work in public art and I think about it I would love to see a statistic of actual monuments that are being erected anymore and actual statues. We don't do that. We don't care about, and people do worship certain politicians and whatnot, but as a whole, we don't care. I don't see plinths going up in front of any place anymore. It's public art now.
Yeah.
And so therefore, and then these things are more about ideas, not about people, and that is because, as we said earlier, the church is no longer the great power. Government still isn't even quite the great power. Corporations, now there's a power, and they're the ones paying the 1% for their new buildings that are then creating new public art, right? So my big curiosity is always and even Black Cube, a great local organization, I'm sure most of you know, they did it. They just did something 2 years ago, or a year and a half, I don't know, COVID years, who knows. They did a thing called wasn't it just called Plinth maybe? And it was brilliant. I freaking loved it. They just had empty Plinth and they're all right, artists, not a single artist really had these Columbus-like figures or these Buddha-like figures. It was all just it was just art, fine art, And so my question is I just wonder as a society, I think that there's iconography in 1,000 different ways, social media that we've talked about, but the statue on a plinth, I'm very curious if that's ever going to come back into fashion. I think it's just, that's over.
Can you imagine a Mount Rushmore size Nike swoosh? Would it be, it would be
I'm surprised that doesn't happen.
It would be so surreally inappropriate, never would happen, because it's somehow.
But they'll make it out of steel and put it in front of their headquarters and it's
But actually bigger, not Rushmore.
Yeah.
And I think there's somewhere in our DNA, maybe that a corporation can't quite go there because a statue is supposed to be about bigger ideas than at the end of the day, you just want to make money, right?
Sure.
So we can't, we do with the icons, you can't make icons exactly to money, do they? Are there?
So thinking a bit more globally, for example, at the old Europe, sculpting was a form of art, fine art. So some of the sculptures, they are defaced, they're missing limbs, and that was a show. Maybe it was because during some time, usually they say that something happened during transportation, or there's a war time, or maybe there was a period of hatred where there's a form of vandalism that happened. We value them because they fermented through time, but through thousands of years, and they show a rich history. We travel from place to place, they travel from place to place. When Aphrodite came to Copenhagen, I went there to see it, right? So the question is, why are they not art forms anymore? This is not the first time it happened. America has quite a recent history, at least the one I'm aware of to talk about, versus other places. I don't even know a lot of what's happening in Asia that's even richer in culture than in Europe, which I'm very familiar with. But some of those statues stayed over time, and they're extremely impressive. And even though I have never venerated Venus or Aphrodite in any form, I still found a form of veneration when I see it. There's something that is triggered in me when I see some of Rodin's sculptures, when I look at David. And again, it's just, I think the idea of an icon is kind of an interesting step function, which means that if it's long time ago, but enough long time ago, then maybe some of them, if they survive these forms of vandalism, they could be worse, don't have any more good. Political, I don't know how to call them, acts, like what happens recently, and all sorts of maybe changing with, life science or other design, like science
But
or
they could-
concept. And we could have them, but some of them are going to survive and they're going to come back. And it would be interesting to see if we come back in like 40 years from now, which one of the things that we talked about today are going to be coming back. Although 40 years, I think it's, in general, looking at the history was too short of a time, but given the cycle, it could be, a long time span today. But it's interesting looking, as I said, at like older cultures, where we still have preserved some of this strong imagery from like thousands of years ago, strong timelines there.
It's interesting to talk about like the US and Europe, because I think that's where most of this has occurred in the last few years, and that it's such an individualist society, because in Asia, I think it's fascinating, there's still places that are erecting like these giant Buddhas. I went to Hainan Island in China and they made like the biggest one, she's massive, and so it's like they're still perpetuating that kind of icon worship. And I went to Bhutan, and again, the biggest Buddha, it's like, it's fascinating, right? Like, they're still in that mindset, because I think that there's still collective mentality in places like that where it is controlled, where people are gonna venerate something. Especially I was in Bhutan, where they're all Buddhist by like, sort of order, and so there's not really a question. There's still, again, I think, different sects and different temples, but there's still this general collective worship or collective memory, because you still have the mythology in place. You still know the history of how, Zabra came from Tibet and fought Tibet. There's all these that are still fresh, and like I think it's fascinating here where we're just like becoming more and more individual and like the marginalized communities, right? So like I feel like we're just in this place right now. Like, who gets their voice, like who's. And so it's such a mishmash of where I don't think there could be figurative icons in the US right now, because how can we decide? Like who is that? So I think we are linking so much to conceptual art, because it does feel more democratic. It feels like, I think a lot of artists are trying to be inclusive in that way. Like, I'm not trying to be authoritative, I'm trying to like be immersive and be, generous in that way.
I think the individualism is a very big key to think about in the Western world versus in other cultures. The podcast Freakonomics just did a great couple series. It started out with the question of like, America, there will never be another America, so why are we pretending like we're something different? Like, it was the title of the show. But they dove into that, and they took that economist study of like, the one where like, if I have $1, but I give you so much, then you get to keep it. I forget that study, but and they were like, we've always looked at that from the Western lens, individualism versus, they even like broke it down into even like the pandemic, where it was like in America, people got to choose, you wear a mask or you don't, and then, but what that individualism led to was, coming up with a what's the word, the cure, the vaccine faster. But then, in like a lot of Asian countries where like there is this collectivism, there was a lot less rate, because everybody agreed, socially agreed. Yes, we all do. We'll wear a mask. We'll socially distance. We'll obey the rule of law. But here in the West, we're like, don't you ever tell me what to do? And so looking at icons, I could
I wouldn't say the West, America.
America, yeah.
Maybe Canada too. Yeah. West, yeah, Europe still thinks we're crazy. Ontario was locked down for months, so I think it is a very US, phenomenon.
So does our worship of individualism then lead to the destruction of traditional icons?
Probably, right? Because I don't agree with that. And then let people go, yeah, me neither. And then you go, well, what do you agree on? Replace it. And that's where we're at. Something colorful and abstract. That's why businesses choose shitty public art. Because they're like, it's colorful, it's abstract, no one can argue. Do it. Like, what does it mean? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Good. That's great.
I think it is a combination of consensus and also authoritarianism.
Totally.
Who knows what punishment you would get for vandalizing, right?
Which is, but again, always in flux. What you're just saying, though, is something in flux. The Russians are airbrushing the old painting because so-and-so did that. That idea of authority, that idea of, and you said something besides authority, something. I mean, isn't that, I mean, that's kind of depending on who's in the driver's seat right now. You know, think about, I don't know what you're talking about, like the Buddhas being built in Asia, but who's destroyed more statuary Buddhas than China? I mean, they totally made it a hit list. You know, they go out and they tear down a lot of these things because it seems to me they do it because it's a way of disempowering, undermining the people who did relate to them as an expression of who they were. And so if you tear down those expressions, it's a way of controlling, getting at, dominating those people. You know?
Oh yeah, that's the end of time, right? That's what we've been doing this whole time. I think in all ancient civilizations, there was always this competing. And that's like what public sculpture, public art is the form of propaganda, right? I mean, all of the communist revolution, you know, the way that they were really used art as a tool, you know, like what you're talking about, art, you know, is a tool or a weapon, and I think it's both, right?
And it comes, you know, it's cliche to say, but I think there's a lot to be said for that the victor, the winner, however it's said, writes the history. And that's kind of true, other than you have sort of subversive elements below that that try to express themselves in the face of that general reality.
I just think people should be given the opportunity to also read history, monitor. So that's where I think I have to play important.
It'd be great if they could read the history, but have it presented to them as this is a relative interpretation.
I know. So that's a big question. How do we read the history? How do we make sure we have a good read of the history? And that's where icons play an important role, and the interpretation and the reenactment and everything we talked about. Because the writing we are doing it right now, we're writing history right now, but how do we make a fair opportunity for people to actually read it as well, and learn from it as well as
Has to be accessible.
Sorry, whose history gets taught. I mean, the big new thing is let's not teach critical race theory, right? You know, I mean, which is absurd because like critical race theory is like a legal theory. It doesn't even make any sense what they're coming. I mean, they're not teaching third graders, you know, for legal analysis, but it's yeah. I mean, there are fights about not just how we interpret it, not just who gets to write it, not just who interprets it, but where we get to teach it, and who gets to listen to it, and how you have to respond to it. I mean, there's so many questions. Right?
And can there be an end to that? That we can imagine. That what you just said, how does that stop?
Or is it supposed to stop?
Or is it supposed
Is
to
it
stop?
or you know, going back to what you're saying of the icons, or whether we'll have icons, it could be just we go back to storytelling or educators, so we are storytellers, or reenactments or theater as opposed to the static image, or the static image becomes a moving image. And the static image of stone is like way too static for a contemporary culture. There seems to be the case.
I like your idea about AR. Just a blank sort of form and shape and your phone based off of which they know the data, right? And it's like, oh, that's who it is, cool, you know?
Or an app where you create your own AR image that you it is nearly 3, so that is an hour. I don't know if people have to go right away or you want to do a third prompt or what you would, as a group, would like to do.
I can hang out.
Yeah, we can.
Will you do a third prompt or leave it open or have a different question?
Maybe if we time box it, that would be easier for people to.
What's that?
If we time box it, if you say we do another 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Let's do another 10 minutes. What would you like to do 10 minutes of? The third prompt is about, I could read it and then we could decide if we want to respond to it or do another question. Regarding the persistence of 700 Confederate statues left standing in America, 87 removed since the 1800s, contrasted with the 4,000 Lenin statues quickly demolished in Ukraine in 14 years, how can we explain the American passive public order that has recently turned active? This has a little bit to do with the article Monument of the Mind, where the Beijing artist moves to Hong Kong and he's really surprised that the protesters have rallied around Queen Victoria's statue. Like, this is kind of ironic, like why are you against this imperialist statue? So, and he was shocked at their passivity, and are not a reaction to this.
I like that 14 years seems quickly.
It is quick. 4,000 statues is a lot.
Is that not?
How many did it take to make them all?
I got 14 years. 85 vacation days to make 5,000 statues.
For better or worse, is that not just an expression of the difference between democracy and a more authoritarian political statute? We don't need to fucking talk about this. We don't need to get voted. We just gotta fucking do it.
People tore them down, not the government.
But the making was the making of the lemon.
It was
the
an
making of the lemon.
Oh, I think.
You know, it's kind of like, we've become somewhat critical of ourselves, and I think questionably, appropriately, I don't know that. Think about how polarized we are as a people. What the hell can happen anymore? It's kind of like, it's the dual side of, okay, we all need to talk about this, as different than an organization where it's just like, because I say so now.
Right.
Things happen, think about, well, it's kind of everywhere. Where you see in certain situations, which I'm not saying bad, they can have a dark side to them, but in terms of how come it takes so long to get things done, think of the process that has to be gone through to get things done.
But we haven't gone through a process in the country. I mean, I think one of the things, I mean, with the toppling of Lenin or sort of dictators, there is sort of that's a flow of a line of an autocratic. That's what I thought you meant with the difference. But I mean, this country, you go to Berlin and you probably feel the presence of the Holocaust there in the monuments, right? You can't walk through the city without feeling it.
The whole country.
The whole country, right. But in our country, we have never reckoned with our history. We have refused to reckon with it. And with your victor goes the spoils, I mean, one of the reasons for that is that we benefited from slavery. We became a superpower. You know, Germany lost the war. They turned around and reckoned with it, right? We haven't, partly because I think there's this sort of guilt or whatever, but actually this unwillingness to recognize that America became the superpower that it is based on our racism, slavery, past history of slavery. And so we haven't dealt with it.
We haven't dealt with all the lost cause people who they'll do anything but accept that history. You know, it's like, yeah, we lost.
Cracked into that a little, I think, in an interesting way. I mean, things that are passed along generationally. I mean, I think it's a process, right? But my point is we've never gone through a process. I mean, South Africa, there was a reconciliation commission. We haven't gone through that process.
But we just did.
We're talking about it.
We just did. And so you said it great, Kate, like, we've never really lost the war until we got the epitome of it all, i.e. Donald Trump in the office.
Right.
And then we, as a society, said, oh shit, now we've lost. And that's when we had a massive uprising, right? And could we argue that that's why?
But we're not monolithic culture. I mean, look at the United States is probably one of the most multicultural, multi-ethnic, diverse countries, nations in the world. And I think there's always going to be, and always has been since the very beginning, all sorts of tensions because of that, because of our multi-ethnic makeup, because of our multiculturalness. And I think that anytime one side starts getting a little too much power, the other side's going to push back, or other sides. I think that we're always living in that tension. I think you're right. When as soon as Trump came into power, all of a sudden people said, enough, we need to stop. We get the Me Too movement, we get the second rising of Black Lives Matter. I think all of that kind of coalesced. But I think that now that he's out of office, and Biden's office is much more mellower and much more intelligent, and that those tensions are going down again. They're going to kind of go back to a little less than a simmer, and I'm hoping that we're not going to lose momentum and making progress. But I think because we always have been, always will be a multicultural, multi-ethnic culture, that bringing up all those tensions is very dangerous. They can lead to
justice.
We don't want that.
So, I, as a European that has lived here for really, I think US, and I'm not going to use America just because there's much more than the US. US is in a position of picture right now. And I remember the day Trump won at the embassy, when I was meeting my American friend, wanting them to take some form of responsibility for that. And they wouldn't. They would look at me and they would say, I'm sorry for you guys. And I'm like, okay? Because America is a position of power, and then Trump would have led the world, but still not seeing them going through the process of taking responsibility for holding that power to vote and decide, but feeling sorry for me, and I was like, okay, but I'm having power in this decision-making process. So the US is in the position of the victor. There is no accountability or something that would make them go through the process.
The victor in which conflict? In the structure of what you're saying?
In the power.
All conflict.
In the power around the world. So it's my power.
And our power was built on our history that we didn't want to reckon with.
Because
Right.
like there was a mention before, like in terms of the war, and because Germany lost the war, they were forced, checkpoint Germany is America, the US Army in the middle of the lane, making sure that everything is in check in Germany, right? So they were forced to go through a process of revisiting the actions. And the entire Europe was forced to go through the process of revisiting the actions, and where it led to not only do the mistake once but twice, consecutively. And it's our grandparents. We have a living memory of that. So yeah, the US is in the power and victor position right now, and it's going to be interesting. How is it going to be held accountable in any way and go through the process of being responsible?
I was really questioning that. Just when you say we're in a position of power, I'm not really authoritative in a way where I can really pull out numbers and stuff. I really question America's position in the world at this point in history. I really am not.
What's the reigning empire if it's not America right now?
Say what?
China's what's the current reigning empire?
I think it might be more of a jump ball, China for sure. I think that in ways that, again, it would have to be, let's define power. Ultimately, we're going to start talking
influence,
about
it's economic influence.
Yes.
Like I don't see kids in every public school learning Mandarin right now, right?
No,
Or in Europe or anywhere else learning Mandarin right now in every school.
I think no, of course not. But if you look
But
at
if they were the reigning empire, then they would be.
if they were the reigning empire, I think the reigning empire even doesn't mean today what it meant 50 years ago. Doesn't mean we can beat the shit out of you, so we're boss. I think if you started to get down into the real nitty gritty of money and how things are moving, I'm just personally not sure I see America, especially as divided, as conflicted within itself as it is. I don't see us being in this driver's seat the way the image of America once was. 1950s, okay, we ran the table, World War II is done, we're the ones, none of the line. I don't think that's true anymore. I really don't.
Well, right is following. I mean, we're definitely turning the corner. There's no question, but we're still pretty ascendant. I mean, we're definitely curving down, although others are curving up. But that's true. We're not in the heyday, the apotheosis of American power, but I would still say we're pretty darn dominant.
In terms of corporate power, I think we're still on the rise. I think corporate power, economic power, and how we influence the rest of the world is still
The GDP is the highest.
Yeah, that's true.
So what?
The GDP is the highest anymore. I can afford that. I checked it out 2 years ago.
I mean, whatever box you want to pick, like it checks.
Well,
I don't know what metric you want to use, but I'm confident that the metrics would show that America has the greatest influence
I
and
think that
pressure on other countries.
right, just take a look at Afghanistan.
Right, like Russia only wants to have their leaders meet with our leaders so they can be like, see,
Right.
we're being acknowledged. We're messing with their elections and they're still sitting down with us. Like, isn't that awesome? Those are all just
How does this lead to art? How does this lead back to art and destruction? How does all this conversation lead back to art and destruction?
I was going to say that.
Because we're mentioning the victor, we're mentioning the position of the victor in deciding the icons. And then we're mentioning the part of responsibility that made the presence of very hurtful history and icons of hurtful, and it's hurtful, like it is going through Europe and feeling that heavy architecture in Berlin, that the greatness of the values in history But dealing with that and acknowledging it, and because of this, we got to why is that part of the US context. So that's how you.
Right, and failing to stand in that position and be like, yes, I'm the one who's dictating the direction we go, is slipping out of that responsibility. If you say, like, we're not the ones who are dictating the direction that the world goes, or who has economic pressure points you can push and pull, then you get to slip out of it. You get to point turn and be like, I feel sorry for you guys. Or if you say, like, you know, all lives matter, I'm a struggling white Southern guy, I don't have any power in this like debate in politics, then you get to slip out of that, like, argue. You get to, it's a
gaslighter kind of turn the corner.
I
dropped it on top.
Yeah, but I mean, it's exactly goes to the heart of what you say.
Yeah.
Be like, I'm sorry for the rest of you. It's a real, like, that sucks. And it is. It's a way of saying, well, I live in New York City. We didn't vote that way.
Right.
You know, it's the real punting the ball to somebody else to deal with.
Application of responsibility.
Yeah, it is. And like a lot of these things are coming down to that root.
I think we reached a final.
I think so too. So, what we do in the end is give people a little space who haven't been able to say one word as the dominant, if they want to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What we do at the end, the round tables.
Yes.
So let's is give people space who haven't had a moment to talk, because some of us are more dominant. If they want to, no pressure.
Did you hear what Kate said?
Just before we close, I mean,
She's the round table from here. I'm the amateur at this, but she said if any of you who hasn't had an opportunity to say something and wants to contribute, you can open it up, because there's a lot of strong, ready to speak people here. So you're not obligated to, but if you'd like to add something.
Well, maybe one thing about affordances of narrative production that I think is important to, because I've been looking at the words, you know, and like how this conversation is framed, and there's a distinction between image as a medium, as a visual, and image as a narrative. And we talk about both actually in this conversation, because image is powerful when it's narrative. Image, when it's abstracted, it's just, you know, pixels on a screen or whatever, or an image in the space. And in that sense, when we think about the affordances of accessing a certain narrative, this is where particularities of, for example, devices and social media are important to understand why it becomes weaponized and why people relate to something even though they don't know the person who was saying it, they don't have any emotional experience connected to it, but the power of narrative production actually communicates at a very deep level. And having even that accountability and understanding that accountability in image manipulation and circulation is a very important thing to have even in daily life, I would say.
Yeah, we're gonna get a psychologist in here to like analyze that aspect of image identity.
Yeah.
You know, like that's why these become really comical, because there is this antithesis of the tourist object and how no matter what, as humans, even though I'm making a commentary on the tourist gaze, which is like the passive gaze, that you look at these and then immediately you try to identify with what t-shirt is like you and what represents you the most. And you can't help it, right? It's not a good or bad thing, it's just something that humans do, like image making, image destruction, image identification.
And
you're right about the image as narrative as opposed to lighter frequency. something sensorial. Yeah.
In terms of icons, people, God created man in his own image. I mean, it's kind of like that, it's drilled in the very beginning of what images are and how people relate to them and how you're different than them. It goes right back to the beginning.
Did you choose not to, that just dawned on me, did you choose not to create a single piece in this exhibition that does have like all of them in one singular piece, right? Because you do identify with a certain one, so to have like, I don't know, a mug that has all of them on it. Or what?
A mug that has all
Like,
of them.
or a t-shirt that says I love food, blown out, pan lemon, torn down.
Or just I love and then demolish and you fill it in. That would be it.
I think that was a conscious choice on your part to make that's why we said like a singular hat, a singular mug, a single postcard. You don't have a collective postcard because are you allowing the viewer to choose the one that they agree with more than
Yes, I was allowing that, but I also was hoping that they would start to question what the work was about because some people would misread it as I was anti-image destruction, or I wanted everything destroyed, and so then they start thinking a little bit more deeper into the choices that I selected. So thank you all for coming and participating. You can choose a t-shirt, and I accept crypto too.